the 32X. It's a bit like when the rich and famous try to keep themselves youthful with oodles of plastic surgery and beautifying procedures. Superficially, you might think, yeah, you don't look old, at least not in the traditional sense. But there's always something slightly unsettling about the whole situation. Well, if the Mega CD was the Mega Drive's initial augmentation, 32X was its nose job, tummy tuck, and Botox all rolled into one. With just 40 games to its name, it didn't take long to compile this list of 9 arcade ports, but they stand tall as some of the best games on the 32X, and occasionally the best arcade ports of an entire generation. Let's go. Now, I wasn't going to rank these, but like the masterful storyteller I am, I thought it would add an extra layer of depth and mystery to the whole video. So kicking things off at number 9, it's Space Harrier. A game that was almost 10 years old by the time it hit the 32X, Space Harrier demonstrated how capable the system's sprite scaling was. A faithful port of the arcade original, and like the Sega CD hardware upgrade before it, gave many of us hope that more modern sprite scaler games would make it to the 32X. Would we see Outrun, Hang On, Power Drift, or even Radmobile? Unfortunately, and somewhat inexplicably, no, we would not. It's like on a game show when they say, look at what you could have won, but I guess we were always destined to lose that gamble. It's another sprite scaler here at 8 with Afterburner. Following on from the absolutely shocking Afterburner 3 on the Sega CD, they released this on the 32X. A far more playable port, it retained pretty much everything that made the original great and enabled us to enjoy it at home. We have the first proper 3D game here now at number 7 with Star Wars Arcade. The original version of Star Wars Arcade was a pretty big deal, granting you the opportunity to sit inside the cockpit of an X or Y wing as you fearlessly battle the Empire in scenes based largely on the first 2 movies. This shooter proved a hit in the arcade, so much so it made perfect sense to bring it to the 32X as a AAA 3D showpiece. Although playing it today with almost 30 years of innovation behind us, it exists merely as a reminder of how primitive some early 3D games could be. Of course, the music and sound effects from the movies are present and correct, providing an epic overall presentation, even if the reality of the situation is somewhat more subdued. Things are really heating up now with NBA Jam Tournament Edition. Now, this is far from the first time we've been able to play NBA Jam at home, but on release it was easily the best. An incredibly realised and enhanced port of the arcade basketball hit, it looked and played better than any other home version before it, and was able to hold its own against Saturn and PS1 releases of the era. If you're a fan of NBA Jam, you should definitely check it out. Now, number 5 is WWF Wrestlemania, the arcade game. Released to the 32X the same year it hit the arcade, it featured digitised graphics for the wrestlers and plays more like a one-on-one fighter than a traditional wrestling game. The action on display here is fast, over the top and incredibly engaging. It's available on multiple platforms including the Genesis, SNES, Saturn and PS1. Once again, the 32X was able to deliver something almost as good as we would see on contemporary 32-bit hardware. Another fighter now, Primal Rage is at 4. This one-on-one monster masher featured digitised characters, albeit from claymation models, and saw releases to multiple platforms. In fact, everything from Game Boy to PlayStation, and even the lowly 3DO, saw a port of Primal Rage. And, as we're beginning to expect from these 2D ports, the 32X held its own here. In fact, arguably the best version to play even now. Although it might not command quite the same visual quality as was seen on the PlayStation, it does feel just as great to play with fast loading times due to the cartridge-based nature of the hardware. The rushed Saturn version means the 32X bests its bigger cousin here in more ways than one. If you're going to play any edition of Primal Rage today, the 32X has you covered. Continuing the fighting theme is Mortal Kombat II at 3. A legendary game that requires no introduction, Mortal Kombat 2 on the 32X was nigh on perfect. It retained all of the art, sound, stages and characters from the original and brought it home. That being said, by 1995 most players already owned or had extensively played one of the many competent home ports on Super Nintendo or Mega Drive. Let that not diminish from what Midway achieved here though. MK2 on the 32X is the next best thing to having the arcade original in your home. So on to number 2, and it's Virtua Fighter. Yep, the original 3D fighter from Sega. By the time the 32X version launched, Sega's very own Saturn and its own Virtua Fighter were on the scene. Let that not diminish from how incredible the 32X port actually is. Just a year into its short life, players were fast losing interest with the system due to its cost, lack of games, and the fact the PlayStation and the aforementioned Saturn were now on store shelves. But Virtua Fighter was like a shot of adrenaline straight into the heart of the 32X, a swan song of epic proportions. Accompanied by tons of marketing, at least by Sega's standards, it was a boon for existing owners and certainly helped shift most of the remaining inventory of 32Xs gathering dust on store shelves. This port of Virtua Fighter might look on the surface to be a lacklustre copy of what was on the Saturn, and indeed there was a much lower graphical fidelity here, but if you could see beneath the dubious looking veneer, what you had was a fast, playable and surprisingly accurate version of the arcade original. The first Saturn port of Virtua Fighter was notoriously bad, so much so that Sega had to follow it up just 6 months later with a better playing and more fully featured Virtua Fighter remix. The 32X version was basically that, at a fraction of the cost of a Saturn. Indeed, a fine send-off for a machine that, like the Mega CD before it, was never able to truly realise its potential. So at number 1 is Virtua Racing Deluxe. I picked this over Virtua Fighter for a couple of reasons, but mainly it's because that for a long time, unbelievably, this really was the best version of Virtua Racing on any home system. The Genesis port, with its built-in SVP chip, gave us a facsimile of Virtua Racing at home, but it was the 32X that was able to deliver the full experience. Compared with the Mega Drive incarnation, it was smoother and more colourful, with better sound and more polygons on screen. There were more cars and 2 brand new tracks to seal the deal. Virtua Racing is one of those games that if you played it in the early 90s, it was somehow able to make an indelible mark on your soul. There's just something magical about the way it looks and plays, with a dreamlike quality that's not only rare but also intoxicating. A future release on Saturn was a pretty poor attempt to recreate the Sega magic, and a surprise PS2 port called Virtua Racing Flat Out was the only version that was able to compete with the 32X port almost a decade later. In fact, it wouldn't be until 2019 when Sega's own M2 division ported the arcade original to the Nintendo Switch, with a boosted frame rate up to 60 frames per second, widescreen support, and the ability to play multiplayer either online or offline with up to 8 players simultaneously, that the 32X version was finally put to bed as the most faithful home port to play. Astonishingly, some 25 years later. Wow. Hopefully you can appreciate why this is number 1 here, and it's probably my most played 32X game of all time. Fittingly, for a home console so mired in controversy and missed opportunity, there are a number of games in development for the 32X that would never see the light of day. So let's quickly take a look at a few of the 32X arcade ports that we didn't get. Wing War, another Model 1 arcade game that surely would have been a hit on the 32X. Outrun and Power Drift, 2 sprite scaling racers from Sega that really should have been staples of the 32X library. Sega Sonic the Hedgehog, one of the rarest Sonic games. The arcade original never saw release outside of its native Japan, so it's a shame we didn't see this appear on the 32X or even the Sega Saturn. So there you have it, 9 arcade ports, all great games on the 32X. A system not renowned for games of any quality really at all. But if you're going to explore its admittedly small library, you could do a lot worse than these 9 superb titles. If you like this content, do a sub, do the like thing. You're my favourite, not you. I'm done.